This is the story of a woman who stood 5 feet 1 inch tall, weighed 113 pounds, and earned a title that no other woman in the country could claim, the cleverest female thief in America. Her name was Annie Reilly, and most people called her Little Annie, which turned out to be the worst possible thing you could assume about her, because nothing about what she pulled off was small. Over a career that stretched more than 2 decades, Annie Reilly robbed wealthy families of thousands upon thousands of dollars in jewelry and valuables across the eastern United States, working New York, Brooklyn, and Philadelphia with a rotating list of at least 8 aliases. She broke out of Sing Sing prison more than once, and she managed all of it while looking like exactly the kind of person you'd trust to watch your children. And that's how she got inside your house in the first place. Born around 1844, Annie Reilly came from Ireland, though some sources place her origins in the Hudson Valley region of New York. Details about her early life stay hidden behind the kind of fog that hangs over most professional criminals of this period. But by the 1860s, she had already settled deep into the criminal underworld of the northeastern United States. NYPD Chief Inspector Thomas Byrnes catalogued her physical description in his 1886 book, Professional Criminals of America, and the portrait he painted tells you a lot about how she operated. 5 feet 1 inch, 113 pounds, medium build, brown hair, grey eyes, fair complexion, and a round, full face that made her look younger than she actually was. That youthful appearance turned out to be her sharpest tool, because Annie Reilly's entire method ran on trust. She never picked pockets on crowded streets, and she never cornered anyone in an alley. What she did was far more calculated than any of that. Annie Reilly was a house thief, and by every account available, the best one operating in the country. Her method worked like this. She would approach a wealthy family, posing as a domestic servant, a nursemaid or housekeeper, someone respectable who spoke 2 or 3 languages and carried herself with a quiet confidence. Families saw a small, round-faced, young-looking woman with grey eyes and a pleasant manner, and they opened their doors without hesitation. What followed moved fast. Within 1 to 2 days, sometimes quicker, Annie Reilly would strip a household of its valuables. Jewelry worth $4,000 to $5,000 would vanish, which comes out to roughly $120,000 to $150,000 in today's money, and that was per job. Then she would disappear, adopt a new name, move to a different city, and do the whole thing over again. Part of what made Annie Reilly so difficult to pin down was her talent for becoming an entirely different person whenever she needed to. At least 8 known aliases followed her through the historical record: Kate Foley, Kate Connolly, Kate Manning, Kate Cooley, Kate Williams, Annie Wilson, Mary Ann Reilly, and Kate Connolly. Most of those names start with Kate, and whether that came down to personal preference, a trick for keeping cover stories consistent, or just force of habit, the records never explain. But the pattern tells you something about how her mind worked, because she operated on a system, not on impulse, and that system needed to hold up against a new kind of pressure. By the 1870s and 1880s, law enforcement across the eastern seaboard had started building what they called the Rogues Gallery, collections of photographs and physical descriptions organized by criminal specialty. Burglars filled one section, forgers another, pickpockets another. Philadelphia put together one of the earliest galleries in the country back in 1860, recording each criminal's name, age, height, distinguishing marks, and other identifying details. Annie Reilly's face appeared in those galleries, and yet she kept working for years. The aliases bought her time, but the real advantage came from somewhere else entirely, because Annie Reilly had powerful friends. Understanding how Annie Reilly operated at the level she did means understanding the criminal infrastructure of Gilded Age America. And that brings us to Frederica Mandelbaum. People called her Marm Mandelbaum, and she controlled one of the most powerful fencing operations in New York City, possibly in the entire country. Mandelbaum never stole anything herself. She bought what other thieves took, moved stolen goods through her network, and turned crime into profit on an industrial scale. But here's where it gets interesting. Mandelbaum also ran what amounted to a school for criminals, recruiting talented thieves, training them in specialized skills, and building an inner circle of elite operatives. Annie Reilly belonged to that inner circle. The network around her included Sophie Lyons, later described as one of the country's most notorious female thieves, pickpockets, shoplifters, and confidence women. who was wanted in Philadelphia, among other cities. Kate Armstrong worked the same territory as Reilly and would eventually get arrested inside one of Philadelphia's most famous buildings. Beyond them stretched a broader web of professional women criminals who traveled between cities, shared intelligence, and coordinated their work at a level that left police departments scrambling to keep up. None of these women fit the image of desperate, hungry criminals stealing to survive. They operated as professionals in the truest sense, part of an organized system that treated theft as a trade, complete with apprenticeships, specializations, and a supply chain for moving stolen goods. Annie Reilly stood above all of them. Thomas Byrnes himself wrote that she had stolen more property the last 15 years than any other 4 women in America. Not 4 individual thefts. 4 women combined. And that assessment came from the chief inspector of the New York Police Department, a man drawing on decades of case files, not making casual conversation. America's second largest city in the mid to late 1800s, Philadelphia acted as a magnet for professional criminals of every kind. Old money, new industry, and a growing upper class filled the city's homes with exactly the type of valuables Annie Reilly targeted. Department stores like Wanamaker's Grand Depot drew enormous crowds, which meant pickpockets and thieves of every specialty found ideal working conditions in those aisles and corridors. Byrnes wrote that Annie Reilly was well known in all the principal eastern cities, especially in New York, Brooklyn, and Philadelphia, PA. That word, especially, carries weight, because it suggests Philadelphia wasn't just another city on her circuit. She had a reputation there, a long enough track record that local law enforcement recognized her name. Prison time in Pennsylvania left its mark on her record as well. Eastern State Penitentiary, which opened in 1829, housed convicted criminals from across the state and became infamous for a solitary confinement system that kept prisoners in individual cells with almost no human contact. More than 900 women served time behind its walls over the course of its operation, and Annie Reilly almost certainly counted among them. What surrounded her in Philadelphia fills in the picture even further. Kate Armstrong, another operative from the Mandelbaum network, got arrested on November 3, 1885, while picking pockets inside Wanamaker's Grand Depot, and a judge sentenced her to 2.5 years at Eastern State Penitentiary. By October of 1886, Armstrong found herself in handcuffs again at the Chester County Fair. Like Reilly, Armstrong carried at least 12 aliases, wore disguises including a pair of gold eyeglasses to alter her appearance, and once feigned madness while locked up. Then there was Elizabeth Dillon, who earned the name Queen of the Dips. Dillon worked Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and Providence, and her technique bordered on theatrical, picking pockets at funerals while dressed head to toe in mourning attire. By 1920, she held the title of the most recognized female pickpocket in the country. Byrnes described her as a tall, thin woman, standing 5 feet 8 inches, the physical opposite of Annie Reilly in every way. All of these women formed a web of criminal activity across the eastern United States, and Philadelphia sat at the center of it as a major hub. Annie Reilly, by all accounts, sat at the center of the center. The thefts alone would have been enough to secure Annie Reilly's place in the criminal record, but her story has another layer that sets it apart. Annie Reilly broke out of Sing Sing prison, not once but multiple times. Sing Sing sat in Ossining, New York, and ranked among the most notorious prisons in the country, which made it a place people did not walk away from under normal circumstances. Annie Reilly managed it repeatedly. No detailed account of how she pulled off these escapes survives in the available records, but her small stature almost certainly gave her an edge. At 5 feet, 113 pounds, she could squeeze through spaces and exploit weaknesses in the facility that larger prisoners had no hope of using. Prison infrastructure in this period lacked the sophistication of modern facilities, and that gap between design and reality worked in her favor. A prison warden, speaking about her under the alias Kate Manning, offered an assessment that says everything. He called her the most remarkable woman in the prison, then compared her to 2 other notorious female criminals, Ella Larrabee and Nellie Babcock, and described those women as, quote, pygmies alongside of her. That evaluation came from someone who dealt with criminals every single day of his working life, and what he concluded was that Annie Reilly occupied a category all by herself. Something about how Annie Reilly operated speaks to a larger truth about crime in this period. and it deserves a closer look. Speed didn't make her dangerous, and neither did physical strength or even her connections to Mandelbaum's network, though she had all of those. What made Annie Reilly untouchable for so long was that people looked directly at her and saw someone harmless. A 5'1" woman with a round face and youthful appearance, fluent in multiple languages, presenting herself as a nursemaid, that profile did not match what anyone expected a master thief to look like. And she exploited that blind spot for more than 20 years without changing her fundamental approach. Professional pickpockets and thieves in this era built an entire vocabulary around their trade. Pickpocketing went by the name dipping. A pickpocket was a dip or a buzzer, and targeting a woman's pocket specifically was called mole buzzing. These criminals worked department stores, county fairs, funerals, streetcars, and every public gathering where a crowd could provide cover, all coordinated through fences like Mandelbaum, who moved the stolen goods and networks of accomplices, who supplied alibis and escape routes. Annie Reilly ranked as the best in that world. Not dangerous in any violent sense, because she appears never to have hurt anyone. Dangerous in the sense that, once she targeted your household, you were almost guaranteed to lose everything valuable inside it, and you likely wouldn't notice until she had already moved on to the next city under a brand new name. Annie Reilly's trail through the historical record eventually goes cold, in the way that so many criminal lives from this era simply fade out. No dramatic final arrest closes the story, no deathbed confession, no redemption arc. What survives is a chain of aliases, a string of household robberies stretching across decades, a series of prison escapes that baffled wardens, and the written assessments of the people who tried to stop her and couldn't. Thomas Byrnes, the man who literally wrote the book on American criminals, named her the cleverest woman in her line in America. A prison warden called her the most extraordinary woman he had ever housed, and the stolen property, attributed to her over a 15-year stretch, exceeded what any 4 other women in the country had taken combined. 5 feet, 1 inch tall, and 113 pounds, Annie Reilly spent more than 2 decades operating as one of the most effective criminals in the United States. If you had met her, you would almost certainly have trusted her with your children. That was the whole point.